Hello, my name is Shaul Cohen. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography, and I'm here today with my colleague Alec Murphy. We're here to collect his recollections on his time here at the University of Oregon. Alec is one of our senior members. He's been in the department for 35 years. He's done a lot for the department. He's been a chair of the department, former president of the Association of American Geographers, a national influence. But today we're here to get some local stories from him about his years here at Oregon. Alec, thanks very much.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here.
So when I think about the period which precedes me, when you arrived here at the University of Oregon, it seems that you were in a transitional moment, that you were the last hire of that older generation, and that you were one of the shapers of the new generation. So if you would, think back to that time and share your thoughts about the department that you came into when you first arrived.
Yeah, interesting way you frame that, because it often got framed later as Pat Bart and I. So Pat and Bart came a couple of years before I did, were the beginning of this, the new generation. But you're right that the department that we entered at the time was still very much the department that had been there really from through the 60s and 70s and much of the 80s. It was a department that some people outside of Oregon used to sometimes say was Berkeley North, because there was a fair influence from folks who had studied at Berkeley with Carl Sauer, and they had been very much influenced by that. It certainly wasn't just Berkeley alums, though, that were in the department. I mean, we had faculty from Minnesota, from the University of Chicago, and so forth. But there was that a little bit of that stamp on the department with people like Ed Price and Al Urquhart and Carl Johannesson. And that department was very much then in the mode of cultural geography as it was thought about and practiced at the time. And there were sort of two elements of that I think I always particularly appreciated. One was the element of mixing or crossing the human and the physical in geography. I mean, there really was a commitment to that, even if it wasn't done all that actively all the time in research. There was a sense that when you're looking at places, you're looking at geographical change, we need to consider both the physical and the human. And so that was kind of almost the mode of the department, was to be sure that we maintained some strength on both the physical and human sides of the field. The other piece of that was, which was very much part of traditional cultural geography, was just a strong interest in development through time, so a real historical sense of doing geographical research. And both those things really resonated with me, so I kind of felt comfortable coming into a department with those kinds of emphases. On the other hand, I came here with a research interest in something that actually had not been represented much in the department at the time. My main subfield, I guess you could say, is political geography, interested in how the political organization of space reflects and shapes cultural, social, environmental, other kinds of phenomena. So I wasn't straight line in that tradition, but I was developing something that in a sense took aspects of that tradition and then sort of applied it in some other areas. And I think I was working in that realm at the same time that Pat and Bart were here, starting to build some sort of newer research interests in climatology and geomorphology. And I think the three of us started to sort of set in motion then something that made it a little bit harder to see the department just as Berkeley North, even if we had that kind of historical influence to it. And I think, just by perhaps chance, all three of us were kind of focused on things that were getting a fair amount of attention at the time. So we're, in some senses, able, I think, to maybe raise a little bit more national attention to the department, although there certainly were interesting and important things that had been going on here beforehand, and build on that in a way that allowed us actually over time to expand the department, to bring in more students, and well, the rest is history, or maybe I should say geography.
The rest is geography. And when you got here, Alec, you hit the ground running. You've had a remarkable track record in terms of publications. You've received numerous awards along the way. You've taught around the world and visited more countries than the rest of us put together. When you arrived here as a newly minted faculty member, did you have a vision for how this department would fit into the bigger picture of geography? I know that you see things at the national and international level. Did you have some sense of where you wanted the department to go, and do you think that we've gone that way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because it was when I got the job here. I mean, I was delighted to get the job here. This I thought was a nice place to be in terms of a place to live, and it was a department that I thought would be sympathetic to my research interests and so forth. But to be perfectly honest, I thought, well, this will be a good place to get started, and I wasn't necessarily thinking career long, when I first came here. But within a few years, I first of all just very much liked the place. Of course, I had children, and they start developing connections here, and ultimately my wife gets hired here as in the law school, and so there's a lot of inertia to those sorts of things. But within a few years, I think I did start thinking more strategically, maybe long term, about the department. And one thing that made that possible, frankly, was that when I did come here, I was not treated like the little junior faculty member who won't be listened to. I just felt like I was treated kind of as an equal. So, I started, I think, maybe bringing a couple of new ideas of things we should be doing in terms of our curriculum, things that might be place a bit more emphasis on the intellectual history of the discipline, on methods, on some of the things that were a bit more sort of cutting edge by the 1990s. And I'm not so sure it was sort of a strategic plan, but Pat and Bart and I would talk a fair amount, and we were certainly engaged in various ways. And I think one of the reasons that I just liked staying here through time, as we moved through the 90s and into the aughts, is just this sense of we were moving forward, and this was a interesting place to be, and that just kind of helped me keep me here.
As I recall, your dissertation advisor said that Oregon is a place that people don't leave. You meant that in a good way.
Right.
And you've certainly had many opportunities, but you've been a geographer in some respects your whole life. You did take a detour to law school and some practice along those lines. What is it that makes you a geographer, and what is it that makes you an Oregon geographer?
Right. So the hint behind the question, of course, is that I grew up, I'm a sort of second generation geographer because my father was a geography professor, so I did kind of have it a little bit in my DNA from the early going. Didn't immediately take that track, but then kind of was drawn back to it. I think what makes me a geographer, a couple of different things. I think I have a kind of magpie mind, as I sometimes say. I'm just interested in a lot of things and how they fit together. And so I think some people have the kind of mind where you really want to delve down, and other people have the kind of mind where you want to see how things come together. And to me, sort of geography is a great way to do that. I suppose if I weren't a geographer, I'd probably be an historian, because historians tend to want to try to tell stories that bring things together in terms of how things evolve through time, and maybe our equivalent a bit is space or place, where we're trying to understand things that come together in that way. What makes me an Oregon geographer, I think, has been a little bit what we were talking about a few minutes ago. A sense of, I still have a sense of that continuity with a concern to think about the discipline not just as human geography, not just as physical geography, and the kind of historical interest that I think is another inheritance of that kind of Berkeley school. So in both my teaching and my research, I'm often interested in trying to understand how things change and develop through time. Because to me, you can't really explain and understand a contemporary geographic pattern unless you see where it came from.
Alec, your education was initially on the East Coast and then graduate school in geography in Chicago. You have interests in Europe, in the wide world, in the nature of the state and the state system and territory. You ended up in Eugene, which is a perfectly pleasant place, but not perhaps central to much of the universe. It's kept you busy flying on planes quite a bit. How has it been for you to take the whole world as your study area while residing here in Eugene?
Right. Well, I suppose, I sound like a product of the early Paleolithic when I say that, when I first came here, there was no internet and there was no email. And so, in that sense, being in Eugene might cut one off a bit more. Actually, air service wasn't as good as it was back then either. But in one sense, it really wasn't tremendous disadvantage not to be in a Chicago or a New York, because you can be so easily connected in terms of the sort of technological and transportation developments that have happened during the course of my career. So I kind of always liked the fact that I could move around and be involved, but come back to a place that ultimately I felt very connected to and that I could call home.
I remember you used to have sizable stacks of boarding passes. Your travels helped to put Oregon geography on the map around the world. I want to shift for a moment. You have by now had students who are children of people who were your students. In thinking about the time that you've been a faculty member here, has there been any arc that you can narrate in terms of the work that you've done with both undergraduate and graduate students?
Yeah, interesting question. The work with graduate students, I'll start there. The work with graduate students, I think one significant way in which that has changed is that when I first joined the faculty, students didn't come saying, I want to work with Shaul Cohen, or I want to work with Alec Murphy. They might have had a sense that that was the person who would end up as our advisor, but they came to work in the program. And then they gravitated towards one or another of us. So there wasn't that kind of upfront commitment of a singular relationship. And so it tended to be much more just a broad community of graduate students that you interact with. And there's been a lot of sort of segmentation as people have increasingly sort of thought of themselves as part of individual research groups, or labs is now the example of physics MD finding its way into geography to the way that folks define themselves. And that does have some impact in the way that one works with students. I think also I've developed more and more sensibility with grad students of the importance of helping them not just as researchers and potential teachers, but also just in more general professional development ways. And I pay a lot more attention to that, I think, now than I did in the early going. At the undergrad level, of course, I teach a range of classes from quite big ones to fairly small ones. Sometimes I worry that I haven't changed as much as I should have on the undergrad front. On the other hand, when I came here, it was much more just in the very strict lecture mode, and the kind of active learning, really that whole sweep of ideas that have crossed the academy in recent decades is something that I kind of started working more and more into my teaching. Maybe not enough in a couple of my classes, but one of the classes I taught is Geography, Law, and the Environment, and it was very much centered around local research projects where people would actually, students in the class would do a project on the historical development of a local landscape with law as part of, how did law affect and change what was happening. We'd organize this around field trips with students going out and presenting their work in the field and so forth. So that was an example of, sort of embracing some of this active learning thing in a more significant way.
In all the years I've been here, your courses have always been full, and sometimes there's been a waiting list. Are there courses that you have enjoyed teaching more than others? Is there a topic within those courses that you feel it's been most important for you to try to convey to your students?
Well, I suppose, if I had to choose one, it would be my political geography course. It's the most strongly tied to the main research I do. And I keep thinking, I suppose what keeps motivating me about that class, I keep thinking, the things we talk about in that class that we look at and we try to examine are so fundamental to trying to understand the way the world works today. And I know this is going to sound, a little bit overly self-centered, but I keep thinking it's the kind of class that every undergraduate should have. We're functioning in a democratic society. We should understand something about the way that the world is partitioned politically and how that reflects and shapes cultural, social, environmental sorts of things. It's just very fundamental. So that's, I suppose, the one that I have had the greatest sort of sense of connection with through the years. But I kind of like teaching at least once a year a big, broad introductory geography class. I've often taught a regional class focused on Europe, but I've also done, world regional and human geography at one point or another. And I think, though, I like those classes partly because they're the moments to get students who maybe never thought about geography into a room, and all of a sudden they, oh, this is actually not just memorizing capital cities and names of rivers. This is actually really interesting. So there's a chance of kind of turning that light on. And I also like it because it keeps me broad. That is to say, I can't just talk about the things that I spend most of my time on. I have to actually think about things that pull me out of that. And I think that makes me a better teacher even of the more narrowly focused classes, and it also makes me a better researcher and writer.
And you're also a textbook author. Are there ways in which your experience here at the University of Oregon, in our department here in Eugene, influenced what you did in shaping the book that so many people have read in different parts of the country, different parts of the world?
Right. I mean, I kind of got pulled into that almost serendipitously, but by accident, and didn't really take the lead on the project initially. But part of the reason I was drawn to doing it, I assume you're talking about the human geography text, right? Is the book already, sort of seemed to have an orientation that was sort of sympathetic to the way that, I thought about geography as an Oregon geographer. Of course, I added and developed some things. In particular, I suppose one particular reflection of the orientation of this department is we added a lot more on human-environment interaction, which was not part of the book before. So that was something that could be a little bit in that mode of crossing the divide between the physical and the human.
Okay. And Alec, we were talking a moment ago primarily about undergraduate students. For a graduate student at the University of Oregon, whether or not their primary focus is human geography, are there some key things that you hope that they will take from here that are Oregon specific, that will serve them and those that they interact with as they pursue their careers?
Yeah. I'm not sure they would necessarily be Oregon specific, but because it's the kind of things you kind of hope people are getting in a lot of places. But I suppose maybe to a little bit of extent, some mix of an interest and willingness to pursue a particular research agenda, but also to have that broader sense of what it means to look at an issue geographically, and an awareness of what's in and around the more specific sorts of things that one might be pursuing in their research. That's the first thing, anyway, that pops to mind. And then I think the other thing would be, I think for a long time, we had a lot of community activities that helped to bring us together as a department. And this is something that's been much more challenging, of course, in the wake of the pandemic. But even a little bit before that, as more and more people are working at home and so forth, it's harder to actually sort of create the kind of community that I think is actually really, really quite important. And one of the things that I kind of valued through the years at Oregon was the fact that, we just have lunch together once every week or every other week. And that's the way we do our faculty meetings, rather than some real big, we're going to meet for 2 hours every third week and it becomes a stressful thing. We just have lunch together and talk about stuff. And, we have the oldest speaker series on campus that, we used to call the T series, and I guess it's being called colloquium now. But, it was, again, a chance to get together once a week. Whether it's a great talk or a bad talk, it's interesting to have some common denominator that people are discussing, and of course that would be preceded by having some snacks and so forth. So those kinds of things, I think, I kind of hope that my students, as they go off and take up jobs elsewhere, would sort of think about those kind of community building things where they are too.
Well, one thing I know that the graduate students will take away from their time here is that in those weekly gatherings, you're often the first questioner with a great question, no matter what the topic is. So they've learned to have good questions and to be ready to ask.
Sometimes I do worry a little bit that I should lay back. I'm really trying to lay back a little bit more. On the other hand, I always think about it from the speaker's perspective too, and you want the speaker to feel like, we're so excited by what they said that we've got something to say about it. So I wrestle with those two emotions back and forth as I try to figure out how much or little to say.
And you've saved us on many occasions. So I want to shift again, Alec. The university has changed in quite a number of ways during the time that you've been here. Since early in your days, you have been someone known to people in the administration of the college, in the provost's office, in the president's office, in the alumni office, in the development office. You have had a chance to watch the administrations change, And as they do change, and as the country changes and academia changes, the orientations towards our discipline, towards our department change as well. And you've been involved in educating people unceasingly in relation to what geography is, why it counts, and about our program in particular. When you think back about trying to communicate effectively with the administration about geography, what are some of the things that you think you've been able to accomplish there? What do you tell them is the most important thing about our department?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, we are in this curious position in the United States where, unlike most of the rest of the world, where geography is taught a lot in K-12 and people come into colleges and universities just sort of having a sense of the discipline, it's been marginalized in U.S. education. It's starting to change a bit, but it's been marginalized. So there can't be any expectation that even people who have gone through and gotten advanced degrees necessarily sort of understand what it means to sort of think geographically about a problem. And so I do think that, in my interactions, it's, of course, when one interacts with various folks in administrative positions, you always want to have the interests of the institution in mind, not just your own program. But I often look for ways of sort of suggesting how the perspectives of my own program might actually support the concerns of the institution at large. And that usually comes in the form of just the opportunities that are presented to insert something that suggests how looking at something geographically might actually enhance what was going on. So I don't know why this pops to mind, but early on in my time here, because I had spent a year in Germany right out of college and I had some background there, I was brought in on a discussion of creating a German studies certificate program. And the discussion turned to, well, what would be important for our students to know to be have some real background in German studies. And so people said obvious things that I completely agreed with, language and economics and philosophy and so forth. But until I spoke up, no one said anything about environment or settlement patterns or where this was in relationship to surrounding areas. So that was a place where I could use the opportunity to actually engage with something that was being considered, but in the process can show how thinking about that issue geographically actually potentially enhances what's being considered.
Absolutely. And Alec, if you think back again through these years, what challenges stand out in your mind for geographers here?
Yeah. Well, we're not the best endowed university in the world, and it's always been a struggle, I think, to make sure that we have at least the resources that people need to advance their research programs, to do the kinds of outreach that they want to do. So that's kind of one of the obvious ones. I think very early on here we had a considerably smaller faculty than we do now, and it's kind of terrifying to think of if we even lose one person, we're going to lose a key leg of the stool. We have grown some, so that's a little bit less of an urgent challenge, but I still worry. There's been actually, a little bit of retraction the last couple of years with retirements and so forth, and we're not quite sure where that's going. And so I think a challenge has always been to deal a bit with the thinness of what we have. Although that's a thinness against a backdrop of pretty considerable student interest in a lot of things that our department does for the campus. Both on the teaching side of things and on the service side of things.
Alec, when you were department head, you invested in geographic education. When you got here, Joe Searle was here. When we were here, Susan Hardwick joined the department. You were certainly campaigning for geography in your role as president of the AAG and as author. What do you see as the role of a university faculty, of a university department, in connecting with the broader public to educate them about geography?
Yeah, I think it's actually been one of my priorities through the years. I mean, when I was president of the AAG, I actually devoted my presidential address to this issue of outreach, and it's not just geography, but it's more broadly. As I think that what we do in the academy is it's wonderful. It's actually a very privileged thing in many ways, and I think that there's an importance to actually sharing to the extent that we can, that with the outside world. It will help others understand what we do. It can translate into greater public support for what we do. All those things are actually critical to nurture in these times.
And you've had, I don't know the number, but quite a few graduate students at both the master's and doctoral level for whom you've been the primary advisor. You've been on innumerable committees as a committee member within the department, beyond the department. You've helped train countless graduate students. When you think about what they're off doing, what comes to your mind in terms of the ripples that you've put in motion in the broader pond?
Right. Well, I have to say that one of the more satisfying things is to go to a session at an AAG meeting and see 3 or 4 of my students, in and around doing things. I mean, it's one of the great joys of the job. In a way, I counted them up a couple of years ago, and I had hit 25 PhD students. And with the 26th was going to put me at exactly the same number of women and men, which I'm kind of proud of as well as PhD students. More than half of them have gone into academia and have academic positions of one sort or another. And it's always really gratifying to see people succeed in that way. But some of them have not, and that's been gratifying too, to see what they're off and doing. I do worry with the wake of the pandemic and the job market these days. I worry a lot now about students being able to work out the kind of positions that were kind of more routinely being worked out a few years ago, and so that's another challenge. Back to your prior question that I stress about these days.
Sure. Well, we've done a lot that might typically be on your CV. Your CV is pretty thick. We would need hours to go through it all.
Thankfully, we don't have those.
We don't. But aside from those sort of typical things, are there some moments of joy, of pride, of contentment in the years here that come to mind that you could share with us briefly?
Sure. I mean, when I think of moments of joy, it's walking or biking into campus. I have the good fortune, well, you do too, of living very close by, and I get to walk into a place that I'm happy to be at. And a moment of joy too is, unlike many places where you might go in and oh boy, I have to see that person today. I'm happy to see my colleagues, and I've had a nice office. I had to downsize recently, which was traumatic, but I've had a nice office through the years. So in a very sort of small scale way, those things. And then kind of at the other end of the spectrum, I think I'll never forget the party I was able to throw in my presidential suite for Oregon Geography when I was AAG president. I had one of these huge, suites at the top of the hotel in Philadelphia, and we had Oregon geographers from all generations, faculty and students and so forth, and it just kind of felt like a great sort of celebratory moment on behalf of the department.
Great. Alec, we have just 1 minute left. Any thoughts that you'd like to share or message to the future this last minute? What would you like to tell us?
Well, I think this is a time of great change, great change for universities, great change for even the disciplinary structure of universities and so forth. And it's hard to know where that's going to go and what that's going to look like. But I remain passionate to this day about the importance of trying to look at the world through what I would call a geographical perspective, which means something about trying to understand how things are organized on the surface of the earth, what they reflect and what they shape, and how things come together to create places and differences from place to place. So whatever we call it, I hope we kind of keep that a little bit front and center. And I wrote this little book recently, Geography, Why It Matters. And it was not an effort at waving disciplinary flags to say this is our territory. It was more an effort to say these are important questions we need to be asking. And I guess I just hope that those kinds of questions will continue to be asked, because I think they're really important to understand a variety of social, political, environmental, what have you, issues that are going on today.
Well, I've known you for a long time. I've known you since graduate school, and I know that you'll keep working on all of these things that are dear to you and dear to all of us. So on behalf of the entire community, I thank you for this conversation and for 35 years of leadership and hard work.
Thank you very much, Shaul. Appreciate it.